no one had briefed him to that point that the 5% being agreed at NATO is designed to be 3.5% of hardcore defense spending through military budgets and 1.5% on supportive expenditures like infrastructure, roads, cyber defense, etc. The United States is already doing that. So for President Trump to say we're not going to, I don't think people had actually briefed him that actually, Mr. President, we are. It's the Europeans that aren't.
Well, I think you've just highlighted the priority information requirements that all of the intelligence agencies around the West and the Israelis will be working on. First and foremost, was a good one. But getting back to the NATO summit today, it's quite an important one, given that we've got two major conflicts around the world and we've got instability brewing down in Southeast Asia. What are you expecting to come out of the NATO conference today?
I think today we're going to have a lot of today and tomorrow, I should say, dinner tonight and a meeting tomorrow. There's going to be discussion about Iran, Israel, the Middle East, how to stabilize all of this. That's what people want to talk about. That's on everybody's mind. For NATO itself, the number one issue is setting the target for defense spending as a portion of GDP at 5%. That is incredibly important to President Trump, and it's important for the European allies to do so in order to make sure we retain American support and engagement in NATO. So it's got to be a two-way street, and setting that target there makes it more of a two-way street. So I think that is the big issue. The elephant in the room that is not going to get a lot of attention is Russia's war against Ukraine. President Zelensky will be there at the dinner. He will not be attending the NATO meeting itself. That's just NATO allies. And as far as discussions about Ukraine, NATO's role in Ukraine, Ukrainian membership, I think there'll be talk among the European allies and with Ukraine on the margins. But we're not going to have a big public show of this at NATO in The Hague because the U.S. is now in a very different place. We're just calling for a ceasefire in place. President Trump has tried to draw equivalence between Russia and Ukraine, saying it's like two kids on a playground. That's very different from the European perspective of Russia as a ruthless aggressor against independent democracy next door, and that democracy having a right and need to defend itself. So rather than put that difference of approach or difference of perspective on display, I think Ukraine is just going to be pushed down the agenda as a main topic and focus instead on just the capability issues.
But Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, in his opening remarks, has turned around and said that that Russia is the number one enemy and should be focused on. But it's interesting you talk about the push to 5% of GDP because the United States is spending 3.17% of its GDP on defense at the moment. And that defense is split North Atlantic and Pacific. So, because of the size of the United States, it's focused in two different directions. So there's probably 1.5%, if I'm being generous, that's focused in the North Atlantic area. Is Donald Trump going to sign up to 5%, or is he going to say, no, we're spending enough anyway?
Well, it's interesting because just the other day, he said publicly that, the NATO allies need to do this, but the U.S. doesn't need to. We don't need to agree to that. Probably no one had briefed him to that point that the 5% being agreed at NATO is designed to be 3.5% of hardcore defense spending through military budgets and 1.5% on supportive expenditures like infrastructure, roads, cyber defense, etc. The United States is already doing that. So for President Trump to say we're not going to, I don't think people had actually briefed him that actually, Mr. President, we are. It's the Europeans that aren't.
But again, the talk of this 5% and the European countries and the UK, as I include as part of that, it's great. They're all patting each other on the back and saying we're going to do this and not working out how they're going to spend it. But they're saying by 2035. Does that not give Vladimir Putin a green light to do something before 2035, whenever the big expenditure comes in? And of course, we had President Zelensky in the sidelines of the meetings turn around and make a statement to say that he expected Russia to test NATO's Article 5 within the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think that Vladimir Putin would like to be able to attack NATO, and maybe within 5 years. Certainly, he's trying to increase the size of his military. He's reoriented his economy to military production. He would like to be in that position. Whether he would pull the trigger or not is a different question, but he'd like to be in that position. And I am very skeptical that with the way things are going for Russia in Ukraine, that Russia can really get there unless they succeed in defeating Ukraine, or there's a ceasefire and they're able to regroup, they're able to keep that level of defense expenditure, and NATO doesn't. So that I think is the lay of the land. Now, in terms of timelines, 2035 is meant to be the end point. That's when everybody gets to 5%. It doesn't mean that you don't do anything until then. It means you're ramping up. And that's rational because spending that much money quickly would involve wasting a lot of money. So you've got to build up the programs, you've got to have the equipment to buy, you've got to fit it into forces and a defense plan that is going to be sensible and a good use of money. So I think that timeline is serious in the sense of NATO actually producing a capability out of this. And I think Vladimir Putin will get that too, that this is not a delay or a green light for the next 10 years. It is actually the beginning of a process that will strengthen NATO over that entire time.
But again, NATO's recognition, and a lot of the countries are recognizing that they're not in a good place. You know, the UK has just finished its strategic defence review. In that, it had talked of 2.6% and eventually sometime getting to 3%. And then Keir Starmer is expected to stand up today and go, no, we have got a plan to go to 5%. Well, the original plan was only published a couple of weeks ago, and therefore its foundation has just been ripped up and chucked away. We're seeing Spain turning around and saying that they're not going to stand up and spend 5%. Are we seeing fractures now in NATO, and will Putin start to exploit those fractures?
This is not new. We've always had differences within NATO, and especially differences over willingness to spend on defense. I think the priority for European allies at the moment should be to emphasize unity and should be to say, yes, we need to build more capabilities and we will do so. That's the message that needs to come out. So I was very disappointed to see the Spanish president say this in the way he did. And I expect that they will be getting a lot of pressure now from everybody, not just the United States, from everybody. Don't mess it up. We need the summit to be a success. And then in reality, there will be differences in implementation going forward, just as there were on the 2% target after that was agreed at the Wales summit in 2014. There were massive differences in allied defense expenditure. That will continue, but it is setting the right target at least. And I think that is the number one thing.
But do you think Article 5 within NATO is still sacrosanct? And because there was a ill-informed debate around Article 5 if US assets had got attacked by Iran in the Middle East, because people forgot that or hadn't realized that there's a geographical element to this, and it doesn't include those sorts of overseas bases. But it's opened the debate again, and there are other discussions going on around whether countries can rely on, in particular, the United States coming to their aid should an Article 5 scenario raise its head. Is it as secure as it's always been, or as people have always thought it should be?
That's a great question, because in the sense that people usually mean a large-scale conventional attack against a NATO ally, probably by Russia, in order to defeat that country and take it over, yes, Article 5 will kick in, no question in my mind at all. Every NATO ally will rush to support the ally that's attacked, and the US will do so too. So I'm not worried about that. What I am worried about, however, is that is not the scenario that's most likely. The scenario that's most likely is nuance, a hybrid attack or a localized land grab. And those things are already happening. So we see Russia launching cyber attacks against NATO countries every day. We see them engaging in other hybrid activities, such as disinformation, targeted assassinations, such as we've seen in the UK. We've seen arson. We've seen paid for protests. We've seen the deliberate use of bribery and corruption to influence politicians and political parties inside our own NATO countries. So we see a lot of hybrid efforts by Russia now. They are right now contesting the border, the river border between Estonia and Russia. The Estonians every year go out and put buoys in the middle of the river and demarcate for people on boats where they should be. And the Russians have been going out now and taking down those buoys and claiming that more of the river is theirs. And they're going to keep up these kinds of efforts at borderization, as they have done in Georgia as well. Not a NATO ally, but they've kept moving the fence in Georgia. Imagine if Russia were to look at, say, Narvik, which is a Russian-speaking city in Estonia, and say, that should be ours, or at least part of that. This piece of Narvik should be ours, or the whole bank of the river should be ours. And they do it, and then they stop. Our NATO allies, and I'm thinking even UK and Germany and France, are everybody ready to go to war with Russia over that piece of territory? I don't know. I worry about that. And that's the kind of scenario that is much more troubling, is a limited assault on a sovereignty of a country, which NATO then has to choose, is it worth escalating to a real war with Russia over that?
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.